Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So welcome everyone to day-long metta retreat. I was talking to some practitioners yesterday who are interested in ordaining, maybe, and speaking about the challenge of navigating relationship in a Buddhist context and how one balances cultivating relationships of love and honoring the heart's impulse towards others while not becoming involved in an unskillful way and avoiding sort of the stickiness of those dynamics. And, you know, a simple language the Buddha used around attachment and non-attachment and figuring out, parsing those two dynamics out in our relationships. And it's difficult because the translation of, detachment in English has connotations of distance and coldness, which is not what we are aiming for. You think about the great practitioners we know of in, just cultural figures like the Dalai Lama or, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, in various traditions. And, cold and distant are not the terms that come to mind. So I think it's useful to think instead, the word frequently translated as attachment, upadana, in Pali, is frequently spoken of by the Buddha through the analogy of flame clinging to wood. And perhaps a better term for it would be feeding off of. And I think if we think of, and the second noble truth's admonition or encouragement is to let go of craving, our desire to feed off of. And I think if we look at the problematic element of relationship, not in terms of a word like attachment, which, although I think is correct, is also a difficult term in that its opposite, detachment, has connotations which aren't necessarily healthy to think of in terms, carry emotional resonances which I think can steer us the wrong way. And whereas if one looks at upadana as feeding off of, the opposite of feeding off of is giving. And what does it mean to enter into a relationship with the intention, instead of feeding off of those around us, of just giving and blessing them? And that this dynamic carries over to our whole lives. How do we approach life in a way that's not feeding off of these changeable realm, reaching into a liquid again and again, hoping to find a solid, and instead determining to enter into life with a sense of blessing and learning, listening. In Buddhism, there's a word for the heart, citta, which is difficult to translate, but can be thought of a lot as the somewhat effective quality of our experience, or the part of us which tastes things and knows things and intends. Ajahn Sucitto compares it to the palm of the hand. And there's another word, manas, which means sort of intellect or attention. And Ajahn Sucitto compares manas frequently to the fingers. And manas grasps objects and presses them into the citta, and the citta tastes them. So our intellect, our perceptions, our mind goes out and looks for something and pieces it together into a clear perception, and then presses it, drops it into the citta to try to feed the citta. So sometimes the citta wants to be angry, and that's what the manas goes out. And then, you know, your spouse is no longer some lovely person you live with. He's the person who didn't do the dishes yesterday, and manas will find that person and piece them together into a very clear, crystallized, crusted perception and give it right to the citta, saying, here, you know, this is what you wanted, boss. And Ajahn Sucitto compares the citta to a blind boss sending out his secretary to go get him food or a drink at a coffee shop, something like that. Sometimes the citta wants love or affirmation and sends the intellect out, and then, you know, the intellect will go out searching for that loved one and maybe find a loving, caring spouse and really rejoice in that, or maybe not. And if the citta comes back empty-handed, then, or the manas comes back empty-handed, then the citta, the heart, remains hungry. The difficulty is that the citta, the heart, isn't a creature of the sense realm. It's something else. It belongs to a different strata of experience and of existence. It intends, it hungers, but it can never be satisfied by what it accumulates from outside. No matter what manas brings it, it always remains hungry. Whether love or a reason to hate, it begins just to crave more and more. And so one of, the quintessential element of suffering is the cause is the citta sending out manas again and again, looking for satisfaction, looking to feed off of everything around us and of life, looking for comfort, affirmation, sustenance, and it never finds satiation. And in the meantime, every experience and relationships becomes colored by the fact that they become effectively simply means for our hearts to try to satiate themselves. And then when, as inevitably happens, the world does not provide, and the loved one doesn't feel towards us quite like we would like them to feel, or act like we would like them to act, when the fires come, when even when everything goes right and there's just a sense of dullness, like being in a warm shower for too long, although that sounds pretty great right now, then we get angry. And we don't realize how attached we are until that happens, until the body betrays us, until aging comes, until someone dies. And then we realize how dependent our citta has become on something that can never provide it. So in response to this, Ajahn Sucitto talks about the fact that the only reason for the citta to move into duality again, to move out into the world, is with a sense of blessing, with a sense of may this be well. why else would you go out into the world? Why else would you send anything out? I don't know the analogy here. Maybe it's the boss sending out the secretary with like a bunch of drinks to give out to people or something. But the point being that this movement into the world, if suffused with a sense of giving, is really the one workable dynamic in our situation. And the arithmetic of love, of how much love we can get from those around us, it never adds up. We never come out on top of that arithmetic. You can never win. You can never be loved enough, but you can love enough. And this is not some new sentiment, obviously. We love to talk about metta and moving into the world with a sense of blessing. And yet, as long as we remain paupers in our hearts, as long as we are impoverished, then we can only do so much. You know, if we are starving in our hearts, then what do we have to give out? And how can we not look for sustenance and affirmation from those around us? And how can they not become simply shadows of our desires, those we love? How can we not feed off of the people in the life we've been given and love people with a controlling love that is no love at all, instead of a liberative love? So this is where the Buddha's wisdom really becomes visible in the practical steps he gave us to cultivate a sense of inner well-being that's robust enough that we actually have something to give, so that it's not just talk. And this is where the sense of meditation becomes so powerful. And specifically the Brahma Viharas, the boundless abodes, as they're called, of metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, mudita, sympathetic joy, equanimity, upekkha. In the suttas, these four boundless abodes are compared to the wealth of one's wealth. And Ajahn Jayasaro compares someone who's cultivated the path to someone who, having a career, wins the lottery. And they might continue to work their job just to have something to do, but never with a sense of need or of compromising their ethics for it or of attachment. And similarly, as we cultivate this inner wealth, we maintain our relationships, we go about our duties, we care for those, but we do it with a sense of ease and of having something genuinely real to give, because we've cultivated a skill in how we deal with our minds and our hearts. And that's a real gift to those around us. So this inner wealth is cultivated through a variety of means. And the first spiritual perfection is giving, dana. And when we're cultivating, see, these refined states of loving kindness, of metta, remembering that we have to create a robust kind of basis for it all. And just briefly to say also, you know, when you encounter teachers who have cultivated the heart to a high level, it's just, they're constantly giving. There's so much wealth that they give to those around them. Ajahn Chah would wake up at 3 a.m. and, meditate with the monks and teach and receive visitors nonstop until 9 p.m., 10 p.m. And then sometimes he'd give a 3-hour Dhamma talk for the monks just to test them. And constantly, again and again, the sort of leader of the current Ajahn Chah lineage at Wapapong, Ajahn Liam, I have a friend who's been his upatak, his assistant before, and Ajahn Liam would do the same. He'd get up at 3 a.m., work all day, receive visitors, pour cement, and then by about 10 p.m., he has sort of a team of like 4 assistants because they just can't really keep up. So then at 10 p.m., he has a little tent under his kuti that he sleeps in because he doesn't, to set a good example for the monks. So he'd go into his tent and sort of lie down for a second just so the upataks, the assistants, would feel okay going to bed, and then he'd get up again and go do stuff so people would find him around the monastery at 11 p.m. or midnight fixing pipes at Ajahn Chah's hospital kuti or this or that, just randomly without telling anyone. And when the mind and samadhi have been cultivated to that level, then that sort of giving is possible. So the 4 boundless abodes, they're called the Brahma Viharas. And the interesting thing, just to speak broadly about them really quickly, is in the tradition, the Brahmas, the Brahma gods, are depicted with 4 faces that look in every direction. And I think that's a useful way of conceiving these 4 boundless abodes of loving kindness, metta, karuna, compassion, mudita, sympathetic joy, upekkha, equanimity. They're 4 manifestations of the same thing. So the loving heart, when it encounters suffering, responds with compassion, karuna. When it encounters joy, it responds with gladness, sympathetic joy, rejoicing. And when it encounters something it can't change, in every one of the Buddha's lists, more or less, there's some representative of wisdom. Always that's there, to sort of that ability to step back and take a wider perspective. And that's where equanimity, or how Asbante Analio translates it, equipoise, comes in, is there has to be that face too. Because sometimes it's not the right time and we can't change things, and we have to just take a step back and let people be as they will. And these are unbelievably powerful states. I think another reason that they are called the formless or the boundless abodes is because they permeate someone's life in a way that I don't think many states do. I think the most powerful way you can change someone's life is by, at a small level, or with a small amount of effort, is to tell them to cultivate loving kindness for 10 minutes a day. And my teacher, Ajahn Anand, would say that we should start every meditation session with 10 minutes of metta, of loving kindness practice. But because it's formless also, or boundless in the sense that it seeps into every aspect of life. So, if one as soon as one wakes up, if one brings attention to the heart area and cultivates that sense of loving kindness right immediately, then it changes the tenor of the whole day. Because you can tell right when you wake up, it's when the mind tries to crystallize around something. And so frequently it goes straight to our suffering, the argument, the desire, because it's easy. The suffering is very simple and visible. But if we consciously direct the heart to crystallize around love right when we wake up, then that changes the whole day, because it shifts our trajectory right at the beginning. So Ajahn Viradhammo suggests before you even move on waking up, just lie there and bring your attention to the heart and get that glow of metta going. But before, the issue with loving kindness meditation is so frequently, we conceive of it as sort of shooting metta rays at people in our heads, or, sending out love. And so frequently it's just us. Ajahn Amaro says you have to be quite quick on your feet with metta practice, because so frequently it's you that needs that attention. And this is, I think, one of the reasons the Four Noble Truths are ordered as they are. The first Noble Truth is problematically translated as, I mean, it's not an incorrect translation, but of this is, or there is suffering, there's dukkha, but there's a task attached to each truth, which is it's how we approach each truth. And there's great use in looking at them in terms of the tasks. So the first Noble Truth is to comprehend our suffering. And, a good teacher speaks about teaching in Sandpoint, and a disciple or one student hearing about the first Noble Truth sort of raising his hand and saying, oh, it's like telephone poles. And Frank, the teacher's name, says, what do you mean? And the man said, when I used to work installing telephone poles, and the foreman said, when this pole falls, which way do you run? And I said, well, you run away. And the foreman said, no, you run right up to the pole and you place your hands on the pole, because the safest place to be when that thing falls is right next to it, so you can feel which way it goes. And it's the same thing with our suffering, is if you run from it, then, and most of our lives inevitably have that quality, then there's no winning. And that ethic we understand, but it's very easy to carry it unconsciously into practice, where we sit and we decide we're going to spread metta to this person and that person, not really realizing that our own hearts are bruised and tired. And so I think it's very useful to start meditation sessions just with that coming to our own hearts, our own sense of where we are, and checking in and just holding our own suffering for a time and feeling the bruisedness of the heart and letting that ring for a time. Because the other three noble truths or the tasks attached to them of letting go of craving, the cause of suffering, realizing peace, and then developing the path, all hinge on first having comprehended our suffering. So if we go straight to the path, if we go straight to developing these states of loving kindness without first having turned towards our own hearts and acknowledged our own situation and our own suffering, if that's there, it's just a form of spiritual bypass. And that's what happens with metta all the time. So I'd say the first step in metta is the first noble truth, actually. Before we develop these active mind states, these brahmaviharas, just coming and taking a long, deep breath out, and knowing where the heart is right then. And then cultivating a bit of wealth to give, a bit of sense of well-being. And sometimes that can be cultivated explicitly through these sort of active metta practices, which we'll speak of. But sometimes a lot of it comes from just establishing a sort of simple sense of well-being in the body from breath meditation, just centering first and developing that bright, lucid mind state that comes from skillful anapanasati breath meditation or some other simple meditation. And that bright mind, when applied to loving kindness, is extremely powerful. And then, of course, there's, in our broader life, keeping good morality. And Ajahn Sona speaks about that frequently, how there's a great need for us to keep a clean sense of our own ethics, and that then it's like we crack the window and metta comes rushing right in. So there's more to be said, but I think we can just start with that for now, and maybe walk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll sit for a bit, and I'll just maybe guide the beginning of the meditation for just 5 minutes after we sit, and then just let us sit in silence.